At 11 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, on November 24, 1944, Captain Toshio Iwanaga sat in the cramped cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-61 fighter at Chofu Airfield, 12 miles west of Tokyo. He watched 88 silver shapes moving across the sky at 27,000 feet. They flew in tight formation, each aircraft the size of a small building. Each one carried 10 tons of bombs. The shapes were moving northeast toward the Musashino aircraft factory on the western edge of the capital. Iwanaga had been ordered to intercept. He advanced the throttle, his fighter accelerated down the runway and climbed toward the formation. As he passed through 15,000 feet, ice began forming on his canopy. The cockpit temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. His hands, inside leather gloves, went numb. At 20,000 feet, his engine began losing power. The air at this altitude was too thin to support the liquid-cooled inline engine that normally made the Ki-61 one of Japan's fastest interceptors. At 22,000 feet, his rate of climb had decreased to less than 50 feet per minute. The silver shapes above him continued northeast at 220 miles per hour. Iwanaga pushed his aircraft harder. At 24,000 feet, his airspeed had dropped to 180 miles per hour. He was climbing at his maximum rate, but the bombers were pulling away. Even if he reached their altitude, he would be traveling 100 miles per hour slower than the formation. His aircraft would be unable to catch them. Captain Iwanaga understood something in that moment that Japanese military doctrine had not prepared him to understand. The enemy had built an aircraft that could not be intercepted using conventional methods. Defense was impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most sophisticated bomber ever built when it entered service in 1944. The aircraft was 109 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet. Empty weight was 74,500 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight exceeded 140,000 pounds. 4 Wright R3350-23 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, drove 13-foot Hamilton standard propellers. Maximum speed at 25,000 feet was 357 miles per hour. Service ceiling exceeded 30,000 feet, far beyond the operational altitude of most Japanese fighters. Range with a standard bomb load was 3,250 miles. The B-29 could fly from the Mariana Islands to Tokyo, drop 5 tons of bombs, and return without refueling. These specifications represented capabilities no other bomber possessed. The B-17 Flying Fortress, which had been the primary American heavy bomber in Europe, had a service ceiling of 35,000 feet, but its maximum speed was only 287 miles per hour, and its range was 2,000 miles. The British Lancaster carried a heavier bomb load but was slower and had less range. Soviet bombers were designed for tactical support rather than strategic bombing and lacked both range and altitude capability. German bombers had been designed before the war and were obsolete by 1944. Only the B-29 combined speed, altitude, range, and bomb capacity into a single weapon system. Japanese military intelligence had known about the B-29 since early 1944. Reconnaissance photographs from China showed the massive bombers at forward bases near Chengdu. Reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy indicated that American forces had captured Saipan in June and were constructing airfields capable of handling very heavy bombers. By September, Japanese intelligence estimated that B-29 operations from the Marianas would begin within 2 months. What intelligence could not tell Japanese commanders was whether their fighters could stop the bombers. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force operated several fighter types in the home island's defense role. The Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki was specifically designed as an interceptor. Maximum speed was 368 miles per hour at 17,000 feet. Service ceiling was 36,900 feet. The Ki-44 could theoretically reach the altitude where B-29s operated, but reaching altitude and intercepting a bomber traveling at 340 miles per hour were different problems. The Ki-44's rate of climb decreased dramatically above 25,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, the fighter's airspeed at best climb rate was approximately 190 miles per hour. A B-29 diving slightly from cruising altitude could maintain 320 to 340 miles per hour. The speed differential gave Japanese fighters almost no margin for interception. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Haiyan was faster than the Ki-44 at lower altitudes. Maximum speed was 368 miles per hour at 16,000 feet, but the liquid-cooled engine that provided this speed performed poorly at high altitude. Above 24,000 feet, engine power dropped substantially. Service ceiling was officially 37,700 feet, but combat effectiveness diminished above 25,000 feet. Most pilots reported difficulty maintaining formation and executing combat maneuvers above that altitude. The Ki-61 was an excellent fighter against American P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs at medium altitude. Against B-29s at 30,000 feet, it was marginal. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, famous in the early war period, was completely unsuited for high-altitude interception. Maximum speed at 19,000 feet was 331 miles per hour. Service ceiling was 33,000 feet, but climb rate above 25,000 feet was very poor. The Zero had been designed for maneuverability and range, not speed or altitude performance. Against B-29s, it was nearly useless. Japanese commanders understood these limitations. In October 1944, Colonel Teruhiko Kobayashi, commander of the 10,000th Air Division, responsible for Home Island's defense, submitted a report to Imperial General Headquarters analyzing the B-29 threat. The report stated that existing Japanese fighters could reach the altitude at which B-29s operated, but could not effectively intercept them due to insufficient speed at altitude. The report recommended development of specialized high-altitude interceptors with more powerful engines and increased armament. The recommendation was technically sound, but strategically irrelevant. Japan did not have time to develop new aircraft. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. B-29 raids would begin within weeks. The first B-29 combat mission from the Marianas launched on October 28, 1944. The target was Truk Atoll, approximately 1,000 miles south of Saipan. 14 bombers participated. The raid encountered no opposition and served primarily as a shakedown mission for newly arrived crews. The second mission, on November 2nd, targeted Iwo Jima, approximately 700 miles north of Saipan. 17 bombers participated. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima attempted interception but achieved no kills. B-29 defensive armament proved highly effective. Each bomber carried 12 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns in 5 remote-controlled turrets, plus an additional gun in the tail position controlled directly by the tail gunner. The weapons were aimed using a General Electric central fire control system that computed lead angles based on target speed and distance. Japanese pilots, attacking from standard pursuit angles, flew directly into concentrated defensive fire. The raids on Truk and Iwo Jima were tests. The real target was Japan. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell Jr. commanded the 73rd Bombardment Wing, the first B-29 unit deployed to the Marianas. O'Donnell had orders from General Henry Arnold, commander of the United States Army Air Forces, to begin operations against Japanese home islands as soon as possible. The political pressure was enormous. The B-29 program had cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that was developing the atomic bomb. Congress wanted results. The American public wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor. Arnold needed a successful mission to justify the massive investment. O'Donnell selected Tokyo as the first target, specifically the Musashino aircraft factory in the western suburbs. The facility manufactured engines for Nakajima fighters. Destroying it would reduce Japanese fighter production and demonstrate American reach. The mission was scheduled for November 24, 1944. The date was deliberately chosen. November 23rd was Thanksgiving Day in the United States. A successful raid the following day would provide positive headlines, exactly when American families were reading their newspapers over holiday meals. 111 B-29s took off from Isley Field on Saipan, beginning at 6:15 in the morning. The bombers climbed to cruising altitude and formed into groups of 3 aircraft flying in V formation. Multiple groups formed larger formations. The entire force stretched across miles of sky. The flight to Tokyo covered 1,500 miles and required approximately 6 hours. Navigation was by dead reckoning using magnetic compass, airspeed indicator, and celestial sightings. Cloud cover over most of the route made visual navigation difficult. Radio silence was maintained to prevent Japanese detection. Each crew calculated its own course to the initial point, the geographic location where the bombing run would begin. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, the first B-29 formations reached the initial point northwest of Tokyo. Weather conditions over the target were poor. Cloud layers at various altitudes obscured visibility. Wind speed at 25,000 feet exceeded 120 miles per hour. The wind was blowing from the northwest, directly behind the bomber formations. Japanese meteorologists did not yet understand the jet stream. American bombardiers had no training for bombing in such extreme wind conditions. Most crews had flown fewer than 100 training hours before deployment. The complexity of operating a B-29 required constant attention from all 11 crew members. Bombardiers were still learning to use the Norden bomb sight at combat altitudes under combat stress. The Japanese detected the raid much later than doctrine required. Ground observers reported large formations of unidentified aircraft approaching from the south at approximately noon. The reports reached Air Defense Headquarters 40 minutes before the bombers reached Tokyo. This was insufficient warning time. Japanese fighters required approximately 30 minutes from alert status to reach 25,000 feet. Ground crews needed time to start engines, check systems, and prepare aircraft for takeoff. Pilots needed time to don flight gear and receive briefing on enemy position, altitude, and heading. By the time the first fighters lifted off from Chofu and other airfields around Tokyo, the bomber formations were already approaching the target. Captain Iwanaga was among the first pilots to intercept. His experience was typical. He reached 24,000 feet and could climb no higher. The bombers above him were visible but unreachable. He circled for 10 minutes, hoping the formation would descend after dropping their bombs. The formation maintained altitude. Several bombers had already released their weapons. Others were still on bombing runs. The entire attack lasted approximately 15 minutes. By the time the last bomber turned southwest towards Saipan, Iwanaga's fuel was low and his engine was overheating from sustained high-power operation at altitude. He descended to 10,000 feet and headed back to Chofu. Other pilots had similar experiences. Lieutenant Susumu Ikeda flew a Ki-44 from Narimasu airfield. He managed to reach 26,000 feet but could not close the distance to the bomber formation. His airspeed at that altitude was barely 200 miles per hour. The bombers were traveling nearly twice that speed, with the jet stream pushing them northeast. Ikeda attempted a head-on pass, diving from slightly above the formation. As he closed to firing range, defensive fire from multiple B-29s converged on his aircraft. 50 caliber rounds punched through his wings and fuselage. One round penetrated his engine cowling. Ikeda broke off the attack and dove away. His aircraft was smoking but still airborne. He nursed it back to Narimasu and made an emergency landing with minimal engine power. Sergeant Takeshi Oshima flew a Ki-61 from Ota Airfield. He climbed to 23,000 feet and positioned himself ahead of the formation, planning to attack from above and ahead in a high side pass. As he rolled into his attack dive, his engine quit. Carburetor icing, a common problem at high altitude with liquid-cooled engines. The engine restarted as he descended through warmer air at 18,000 feet. By then, the bomber formation had passed beyond range. Oshima returned to base without firing his guns. The defensive fire from the B-29s was unlike anything Japanese pilots had experienced. American bomber formations in Europe had demonstrated the effectiveness of mass defensive armament, but Japanese pilots had no experience With this type of combat, the Ki-44 and Ki-61 carried two 13mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. The cannons had limited ammunition, typically 100 rounds per gun. Pilots needed to close to within 500 meters for effective cannon fire. At that range, B-29 defensive guns could hit the attacking fighter with concentrated fire from multiple turrets. The General Electric Fire Control System tracked the attacking fighter and automatically directed all guns within firing angle to engage. A single B-29 could bring 4 to 6 50-caliber guns to bear on a single target. A formation of 3 bombers could concentrate 12 to 18 guns. The volume of fire was overwhelming. 24 B-29s bombed the primary target, the Musashino aircraft factory. 64 bombed the dock and urban areas when cloud cover prevented accurate aim on the primary target. The remaining bombers experienced mechanical problems or navigation errors and did not reach Tokyo. Bombing accuracy was poor. High winds carried bombs far off target. Of the approximately 250 tons of bombs dropped, fewer than 40 tons hit within the factory complex. Damage to the facility was minimal. Production continued without significant interruption. By any objective measure, the raid was not successful. But success was not measured only by bombs on target. The psychological impact of the raid exceeded its physical damage. For the first time since the Doolittle raid in April 1942, American aircraft had struck the Japanese capital. The Doolittle raid had been a propaganda gesture. 16 B-25 medium bombers launched from an aircraft carrier, causing minor damage before crash landing in China. The November 24th raid was different. This was not a one-time gesture. This was the beginning of sustained strategic bombing. The bombers had come from permanent bases in the Marianas. They would return. Japanese civilians understood this. American aircraft had reached Tokyo despite Japanese air defenses. The defenses had failed. Japanese military commanders understood it as well. After the raid, Colonel Kobayashi filed another report to Imperial General Headquarters. The report stated that interception of B-29 formations required fundamental changes in fighter tactics and aircraft specifications. Conventional climbing interceptions were ineffective. Fighters could not reach bomber altitude quickly enough. When fighters did reach altitude, they lacked the speed to execute effective attacks. The report recommended 2 options. First, develop new fighters specifically designed for high-altitude interception with more powerful supercharged engines and heavier armament. Second, position fighters at high altitude before bomber formations arrived, allowing fighters to attack from level flight or from above rather than climbing from below. The first option required months or years of development time. Japan did not have months. The second option required advance warning of the bomber approach, which required improved radar coverage and faster communication between radar stations and air defense headquarters. Japan had invested less in radar technology than Germany or Britain. Japanese radar sets were less sophisticated, had shorter range, and were less reliable than Allied equipment. The radar network covering the Tokyo area consisted of fewer than a dozen stations, most with detection range of less than 100 miles. Coverage was incomplete. Radar operators were inadequately trained. Communication systems were slow and prone to failure. Even with perfect radar coverage and instant communication, the tactical problem remained. B-29s approached at 30,000 feet and 350 miles per hour. Japanese fighters needed 30 minutes to reach intercept altitude. During those 30 minutes, a bomber formation traveled 175 miles. Fighters needed to be airborne before the bombers reached Japanese territory. But keeping fighters airborne consumed fuel. Fighters had endurance of approximately 2 hours at combat power. Maintaining continuous air patrols over Tokyo required dozens of fighters rotating through patrol stations. Japan did not have enough fighters or enough fuel to maintain such patrols. The solution that emerged over the following months was desperation. If conventional tactics could not stop the bombers, unconventional tactics would be required. On December 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force issued orders establishing special attack units for Home Island's defense. The units would be equipped with stripped-down fighters modified for maximum rate of climb. All armament, except basic guns, would be removed. Armor plate would be removed. Radio equipment would be removed. Any weight that did not contribute to climbing or fighting would be eliminated. The goal was to reach 30,000 feet as quickly as possible and attack the bombers using any means necessary, including ramming. First Lieutenant Toru Shinomiya was selected to lead one of these units, the Hagakure Tai, named after an 18th century text about samurai ethics. Shinomiya was 26 years old, an experienced pilot with over 1,000 flight hours. He had shot down 3 American aircraft in previous engagements. He volunteered for the ramming unit, knowing that survival was unlikely. The orders were explicit. Pilots would attack B-29s using their aircraft as weapons if guns and cannons failed to destroy the target. This was not officially classified as suicide because pilots were expected to parachute after ramming, if possible. In practice, colliding with a 140,000-pound bomber at 300 miles per hour left little chance of survival. On December 3, 1944, 86 B-29s attacked Tokyo again. Shinomiya and 2 other pilots from the Hagakure Tai intercepted the formation. Shinomiya's stripped-down Ki-61 reached 29,000 feet, the highest altitude he had ever achieved in combat. He positioned himself ahead of the formation and dove toward the lead bomber. His cannon fire struck the bomber's wing. Smoke appeared, but the bomber remained in formation. Shinomiya closed the distance and deliberately flew his fighter into the bomber's horizontal stabilizer. The impact sheared off the Ki-61's right wing. The fighter tumbled out of control. Shinomiya managed to open his canopy and bail out at 18,000 feet. His parachute opened at 12,000 feet. He landed in a rice field outside Tokyo with a broken ankle and multiple lacerations. The B-29 he had rammed, a bomber named Long Distance from the 498th Bombardment Group, lost its entire horizontal stabilizer. The pilot struggled to maintain control but managed to reach the ocean before ditching. 6 crew members survived and were picked up by an American submarine. 5 died in the crash. Shinomiya's survival was remarkable and provided propaganda value for Japanese authorities. He was awarded the Bukosho, Japan's highest military decoration, established only 2 weeks earlier, specifically to recognize pilots who attacked B-29s. The decoration was roughly equivalent to the American Medal of Honor or British Victoria Cross. Shinomiya became the first recipient. His photograph appeared in newspapers across Japan. The caption described him as a hero who had proven that B-29s could be stopped through courage and determination. What the caption did not mention was that it had required a suicide attack to stop one bomber out of 86, Sergeant Masao Itagaki and Sergeant Masanobu Nakano. The 2 other pilots who flew with Shinomiya that day also rammed B-29s. Itagaki's Ki-61 struck a bomber from the 501st Bombardment Group. The collision destroyed his fighter instantly. He parachuted and landed safely. The B-29 he hit lost 2 engines, but remained airborne long enough to reach the ocean before ditching. 7 of 11 crew members survived. Nakano rammed a bomber from the 498th Bombardment Group and also survived by parachute. His stripped-down fighter was later displayed outside a Tokyo department store as evidence that American bombers could be defeated. 3 successful ramming attacks out of 86 bombers represented a kill rate of 3.5%. This was actually higher than the kill rate achieved through conventional attacks, which was approximately 2% on that mission, but ramming attacks were not sustainable. Even when pilots survived, their aircraft were destroyed. Japan could not replace fighters faster than they were being lost. Pilot training programs could not produce replacement pilots quickly enough. Experienced pilots like Shinomiya, Itagaki, and Nakano represented years of training and combat experience. Using them for single-mission suicide attacks was strategically insane, but Japanese commanders saw no alternative. The raids continued through December and into January 1945. Each raid involved dozens of B-29s. Japanese fighters intercepted when possible. Sometimes they shot down bombers. More often, they damaged bombers that limped back to Saipan. The loss rate for B-29s averaged between 2 and 4% per mission, mostly from mechanical failures and operational accidents rather than combat. The loss rate was sustainable. American industry was producing hundreds of B-29s per month. Trained crews were arriving in the Marianas every week. The strategic equation was simple. America could afford losses. Japan could not. Japanese pilots continued writing reports after each mission. The reports repeated the same observations. B-29 formations were difficult to intercept due to high speed and high altitude. Defensive armament was extremely effective. Attacking from astern or beam angles resulted in heavy fighter losses. Head-on attacks were more effective but required precise timing and positioning. Ramming attacks achieved higher kill rates but were unsustainable. Every report concluded with the same recommendation. Japan needed better fighters with more powerful engines specifically designed for high-altitude combat. The recommendations were technically correct but strategically impossible. Better fighters required time, resources, and industrial capacity that Japan no longer possessed. The November 24 raid had revealed a truth that Japanese military doctrine had not prepared for. The enemy had built a weapon that could not be stopped using available means. Defense was not impossible only against individual B-29s. Defense was impossible against the system that produced B-29s. American industry could build bombers faster than Japanese fighters could shoot them down. American training programs could produce crews faster than Japanese pilots could kill them. American logistics could sustain operations across 6,000 miles of ocean that Japanese forces could not interdict. Captain Iwanaga, who had flown the first intercept mission on November 24, continued flying combat missions through early 1945. He participated in 7 more interceptions against B-29 formations. He damaged 3 bombers, but achieved no confirmed kills. On January 27, 1945, he attempted another ramming attack. Unlike Shinomiya, Itagaki, and Nakano, he did not survive. His aircraft disintegrated on impact with a bomber from the 497th Bombardment Group. No parachute was observed. The bomber he rammed lost its entire tail section and crashed, killing all 11 crew members. Both Iwanaga and the American crew died because the technological imbalance between the B-29 and Japanese fighters had made conventional defense impossible. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan intensified over the following months. In March 1945, the tactics changed. Major General Curtis LeMay, who had assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in January, ordered a shift from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks at night. The new tactics eliminated the altitude advantage that had made interception so difficult. B-29s attacked from 5,000 to 8,000 feet, well within range of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. But night operations reduced fighter effectiveness. Japanese pilots had minimal night combat training and inadequate night fighting equipment. Anti-aircraft guns lacked radar fire control for night engagement. The low-altitude tactics proved devastatingly effective. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th through 10th destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed approximately 100,000 civilians. Japanese fighter pilots watched the fires from their cockpits, unable to prevent the destruction. The B-29s had evolved beyond their interception capability, not through better performance, but through better tactics. American commanders had analyzed the defenses, identified weaknesses, and adapted operations to exploit those weaknesses. Japanese commanders had no equivalent adaptation. They continued ordering conventional intercepts against an enemy that had stopped fighting conventionally. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The institutional failure went deeper than tactics. Japan's military culture had emphasized offensive operations and warrior spirit over defensive preparation and systematic analysis. When strategic bombing became the primary threat to the home islands, Japanese commanders had no doctrinal framework for responding effectively. pre-war planning had assumed that any enemy bomber offensive would be stopped by Japanese fighters operating from forward bases. The loss of those forward bases, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, had invalidated the entire defensive concept, but no alternative concept had been developed to replace it. By April 1945, American P-51 Mustang fighters were operating from Iwo Jima, escorting B-29 formations all the way to Japan and back. The fighter escorts transformed the strategic equation completely. Japanese fighters that had struggled to intercept unescorted bombers now faced American fighters that were faster, more maneuverable at altitude, and flown by pilots with superior training. The kill ratio shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. On June 15, 1945, 444 B-29s attacked Osaka. Not a single Japanese fighter rose to intercept them. Japanese air defense had collapsed completely. First Lieutenant Shinomiya, who had survived his ramming attack in December and received the Bukosho, flew his last mission on May 14, 1945. He was leading a 4-aircraft patrol over Tokyo when his formation encountered 12 P-51 Mustangs at 22,000 feet. The American fighters had altitude and speed advantage. They dove on Shinomiya's formation from above. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. All 4 Japanese fighters were shot down. Shinomiya's aircraft was hit by multiple .50 caliber rounds that severed his fuel lines and damaged his controls. He attempted to bail out, but his parachute caught on the tail assembly. He died in the crash. He was 26 years old. Sergeant Itagaki, who had also survived a ramming attack and been decorated, died on March 10th during the Great Tokyo firebombing. He had been attempting a night interception when his Ki-61 was caught in the massive updraft created by the firestorm below. The thermal column threw his aircraft out of control. He crashed into Tokyo Bay. His body was never recovered. Captain Kobayashi, the colonel who had written the reports warning that Japanese fighters could not effectively intercept B-29s, survived the war. After Japan's surrender, American occupation authorities interviewed him extensively about Japanese air defense doctrine and capability. His reports from 1944 were translated and studied by American Air Force planners. The analysis revealed that Japanese commanders had understood the technical problems, but had lacked the industrial capacity and institutional flexibility to solve them. American interrogators asked Kobayashi what Japan could have done differently. He said that Japan should never have started a war with an industrial power it could not match in production capacity. The B-29 represented American manufacturing capability as much as American engineering skill. Japan could build excellent fighters in limited numbers. America could build adequate bombers in unlimited numbers. That asymmetry determined the outcome. The strategic bombing campaign continued through July and into August 1945. 66 Japanese cities were attacked with incendiaries. 178 square miles were destroyed. 330,000 people were killed. Nearly 500,000 were injured. 8.5 million were left homeless. The physical destruction exceeded anything experienced in Europe. German cities had been built with stone and concrete. Japanese cities had been built with wood and paper. The materials that had made Japanese architecture beautiful and distinctive also made it extraordinarily vulnerable to fire. On August 6th, a single B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion killed approximately 70,000 people instantly and destroyed 5 square miles of the city. 3 days later, another B-29 named Bockscar dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people. The atomic bombs received enormous attention, both at the time and in subsequent historical memory. But from the Japanese perspective, they were simply the culmination of a campaign that had already destroyed dozens of cities through conventional means. The March 9th through 10th firebombing of Tokyo had killed more people than the Hiroshima bomb. The strategic effect of the atomic weapons was psychological rather than material. They demonstrated that America possessed technology so advanced that Japan could not comprehend it, much less counter it. Japan surrendered on August 15th 1945. The formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. Among the Japanese delegation was General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. During the ceremony, Umezu stood silently while American officers read the surrender terms. His face showed no emotion. After the war, American interrogators asked Umezu when he had concluded that Japan could not win. He said that he had understood defeat was inevitable after the March 1945 firebombing campaigns demonstrated that American bombers could destroy Japanese cities at will without suffering prohibitive losses. The military could not defend the population. The industrial base could not sustain the war effort. The strategic situation was hopeless. The B-29 campaign from the Marianas lasted 9 months, from November 1944 to August 1945. During that period, American forces flew approximately 33,000 sorties, 414 B-29s were lost, 147 were shot down by Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire, 267 were lost to mechanical failures, engine fires, and operational accidents. The loss rate to enemy action was approximately 1.4% per sortie. This was sustainable. American factories were producing hundreds of B-29s per month. Trained crews were arriving in the Pacific every week. For every bomber lost, 2 were added to the force. Japanese losses were not sustainable. Approximately 5,000 Japanese fighters were destroyed attempting to defend the home islands. Pilot casualties exceeded 10,000 killed. The experienced pilots who had fought in China and the Pacific during the early war years were gone. Their replacements had minimal training and almost no combat experience. By mid-1945, new Japanese pilots were receiving less than 100 hours of flight training before being sent to combat units. American pilots were receiving over 300 hours. The quality gap was enormous and unbridgeable. The industrial comparison was even more stark. In 1944, American factories produced 45,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories produced 28,000. In 1945, American production exceeded 46,000 aircraft. Japanese production dropped to 11,000. The disparity was not because Japanese engineers were less skilled or Japanese workers were less dedicated. The disparity existed because American industrial capacity was 10 times larger and American logistics were secure. Japan's factories were being destroyed by the bombers they were supposed to produce fighters to stop. The industrial base was consuming itself. The B-29 represented more than technological superiority. It represented systematic superiority. The aircraft itself was remarkable, combining range, speed, altitude, and payload in ways no other bomber could match. But the aircraft alone was not decisive. What made the B-29 campaign decisive was the system that supported it. American shipyards built the cargo vessels that transported supplies across 6,000 miles of ocean. American engineers constructed the airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam that could handle the massive bombers. American logistics officers organized the supply chains that delivered fuel, bombs, spare parts, and every other necessity. American training programs produced the crews. American intelligence services identified the targets. American meteorologists predicted the weather. American rescue services recovered downed airmen. Every element functioned together as an integrated system. When one B-29 was lost, another replaced it. When one crew completed their tour, another crew took their place. The system was self-sustaining and virtually unstoppable. Japanese commanders understood this by early 1945. Individual Japanese pilots might be brave. Individual Japanese fighters might be well designed. But individual excellence could not overcome systematic superiority. The recognition was devastating because it contradicted everything Japanese military culture had taught for decades. Japanese doctrine had emphasized spiritual strength over material strength. Bushido, the way of the warrior, valued courage, loyalty, and fighting spirit above all else. The assumption was that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The B-29 campaign proved that assumption was false. Captain Iwanaga had understood this truth on November 24, 1944, when he climbed toward the bomber formation and could not reach it. His aircraft was as fast as any Japanese fighter. His skill was as good as any pilot in the Imperial Army Air Force. His courage was absolute. None of it mattered. The enemy had built a weapon system that existed beyond his capability to counter. All the training, all the dedication, all the sacrifice was insufficient. Defense was impossible. That realization, multiplied across thousands of Japanese pilots, defined the final year of the Pacific War. Young men climbed into fighters knowing they would likely die without achieving anything meaningful. They flew anyway because duty demanded it. They attacked bomber formations knowing the defensive fire would probably kill them. They attacked anyway because there was no alternative. Some chose ramming attacks because conventional attacks had failed. They died because their institutional system could not compete with the American system. The lesson transcends the specific details of altitude performance, engine specifications, and bombing tactics. The fundamental lesson is about asymmetry. When one side possesses overwhelming advantage in industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and systematic integration, individual valor becomes strategically irrelevant. Brave men die. Their deaths achieve nothing. The war continues until the superior system exhausts the inferior system's ability to resist. Japanese pilots saw 40 B-29s in formation and reported that defense was impossible. They were correct, but the impossibility extended beyond intercepting individual raids. What was truly impossible was defending against a system that could produce bombers faster than they could be destroyed, train crews faster than they could be killed, and sustain operations across 6,000 miles of ocean without interruption. That system, more than any individual weapon, won the Pacific War. The strategic bombing campaign destroyed Japan's capacity to continue fighting. The atomic bombs ended the fighting. But the outcome had been determined months earlier when Japanese commanders recognized that American industrial and technological superiority made prolonged resistance futile. The B-29 was the weapon that revealed that truth most clearly. Every raid demonstrated it. Every burning city proved it. Every failed interception reinforced it. 79 years later, the lessons remain relevant. Modern warfare continues to favor systematic integration over individual excellence. Technology continues to multiply the effectiveness of organized forces. Industrial capacity continues to determine who can sustain combat operations over time. The specific weapons change. The fundamental principles do not. The side with better systems usually wins, regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. That is how wars turn. Not through predetermined destiny, not through inevitable triumph, but through systematic advantages that compound over time until resistance becomes impossible. Captain Iwanaga knew this as he climbed toward those silver shapes on November 24, 1944. He knew it as his engine lost power at 24,000 feet. He knew it as the bombers pulled away above him. He knew it when he landed and wrote his report stating that interception at high altitude was not feasible with current aircraft. He knew it when he flew his final mission in January 1945 and chose to ram a bomber because conventional attacks had failed. He knew it when his aircraft disintegrated on impact and he fell 30,000 feet without a parachute. He knew that defense was impossible. He died anyway. So did thousands of other Japanese pilots who understood the same truth but continued fighting because duty demanded it. Their courage deserves recognition. Their sacrifice deserves remembrance. But their deaths changed nothing about the strategic reality. The B-29s kept coming. The cities kept burning. Japan kept losing. And on August 15th, 1945, the war finally ended. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.